Hello class. In the following video, I'm going to speak through chapter 1 of our book, Intercultural Communication, Globalization, and Social Justice. Right away, globalization and social justice are the subtitles of our book, And this chapter is called Opening the Conversation because Catherine Sorrells wants you to think of this as a conversation, right? And so as you encounter these ideas, these concepts, be thinking about your own experience or how you might disagree with her or what input you might have about these important topics. So she starts off with this context of globalization. Globalization, really generally speaking, is just the way that the world has become more interconnected. And the ways that globalization is, of course, impacting intercultural communication, right? So more and more, the world is connected through technology and the global economy, especially technology, right? Just think about how information can travel instantaneously from one place to another, whereas, on other times in the world, information took a lot longer to travel, right? But even like pigeons were once used to deliver messages. And so now we can instantaneously click and transfer knowledge through things like the internet. Even take, for example, like airplanes, right? So nobody really wanted to get on a plane 100 years ago, but now as technology's made the plane safer and safer, right? People can travel really fast, halfway around the world, whereas before it took months, right? Months and weeks to travel. And so that's an example of the way in which technology has kind of shrunk the world. And that is a big component of globalization. It's also economic, right? In the ways that our economies are all interconnected. Think of how goods are made in one country, right? And then they're sent over and assembled to a different country. Even, for example, something like orange juice. If you look in the back of your orange juice, it'll say made from oranges from Florida and or Brazil and or Mexico, something like that. And so more and more our economies of the world are very interconnected. We also must keep in mind that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is, of course, widening. I forget what exactly it is, but the top percentage of people in terms of wealth own 80 to 90% of all wealth in the world, right? So it's like, like 115 billionaires own as much as 80% of the rest of the world. And so taking that into account is part of globalization too, that although there's this flow of capitalism and this interconnected of economies, not all people are benefiting from economic globalization in the same way, right? And some people would even argue that economic globalization is built on inequality, right? It's built on corporations going and finding the cheapest labor, right? This kind of race to the bottom. And so globalization does bring with it this kind of inequality, right? And even in terms of technology, right, we need to take into account the information gap, the technological gap, right? So not everyone also has access to the internet and access to digital media and those sorts of things. And so to keep that in mind as well is also part of the haves and have-nots. Intercultural communication is studied here within the context of political, economic, and cultural globalization. Yes, political, economic, and cultural globalization. And we'll get more into each of those specifically in chapter 2. Catherine Sorrells will break those further down. In this chapter, she mostly, I think, is focusing more on kind of the economic and the cultural. Sorrells emphasizes the role of history, power, and global institution. Yeah, that is key. So part of her look at things is taking into account the role of history and who has benefited through certain institutions and who has not, and taking that into account as part of her approach. We might even call this like a critical approach because she's concerned with these things, history and power. And discerning how those influence institutions, people, and the world today. So the context of the whole book is intercultural communication, right? And that we live in this important time. There was that other quote about how 232 million people or something like that are now in countries that they have migrated to, right? So there's also this global movement of people, of goods, and the interconnectedness of people and goods in our economies and our cultures that is an important part of globalization. And so that is the context with which we're studying intercultural communication. So then the book gets into this, the chapter gets into what is culture. And when we talk about culture, it often gets mapped onto this idea of high culture, low culture, and popular culture, right? And so it's interesting that before Searles even defines what culture is, she kind of problematizes how we've talked about culture. And historically, when we talked about culture, we were often talking about excuse me, high culture, the culture of the elite, right? So, think of things like ballet, symphony, right? The idea of being cultured was, for example, the term cultured means that you have or possess high culture, right? And this idea of low culture, the culture of the working class, and this goes back even to like, in the Western world, this idea of like the barbarians, quote unquote, and those who were civilized, quote unquote, right? And how the people who were quote unquote civilized had culture, and those who weren't civilized didn't have culture, right? And so she wants us to get away from that kind of thinking about culture, right? And nowadays, there's this thing called popular culture, the culture of common everyday people. And this has really become, pop culture has really become an object of study now. Whereas, so we all acknowledge that popular culture is indeed a culture, that low culture is indeed a culture. And there's more of a lens to try to study popular culture, right? The impact of television, movies, what do people actually listen to, right? What are they actually doing with their lives, right? And that is this sort of approach to culture that she really wants us to take, I think, is to have awareness of this kind of divide. But also be aware of yourself, right? The ways in which culture kind of becomes invisible to you, right? We often think, oh, I don't have culture. I don't have culture because, I grew up in a quote unquote white family or, an American, distinctly American kind of context. So be aware that of course you have culture, right? And even white culture and American norms, right? Those are a kind of culture. And to kind of be aware of the ways that you are sort of always already inside of culture. But she wants us to be aware of this early distinction and to really get away from it, I would say. Okay, then she gets into these 3 definitions of culture, which she really kind of talks about as dimensions, right? They're all describing culture, but they're all just sort of emphasizing different dimension of what culture is, right? And the first, and really one of the most helpful definitions is culture as shared meaning, right? And this is, of course, the anthropologic definition of culture. So anthropologists, right, like, well, what is a group or what makes a culture? And it'd be like, oh, it's messages and artifacts transmitted by a group through time, right? And that really is a very helpful understanding of culture. And so this approach says that it's passed down from generation to generation through symbols, right? Yeah, the role of language, as one of you said in your, or maybe many of you said in your discussion post, right? Like the role of language and symbols, right? And how we make sense of those meanings is handed down to us through our group, right? So for example, for the extra credit introductory video, right, I asked you to talk about your name, right? And a lot of us talk about our names as kind of this shared understanding of our name, right? the importance of our name isn't just to us, but it's kind of to our families, right? Some of us, right? And the way that some names get recycled through certain families, or then there's a sense of pride in that, right? And so that question is really kind of getting at an anthropologic definition of yourself and your identity. Culture allows us to make sense of and express and give meaning to our lives. Yes, absolutely. So how we come to learn about what makes sense, right, is taught to us by our group, right? Is taught to us by the people who taught us how to make sense of language, right? How to make sense of symbols, right? If you give, somebody stuffed animals and you say, okay, put these in order, right? Or put these in, different cultural logics based on where we're from. We might put things into groups and organize them differently based on where we're from, right? And when we share the system of meaning, you become a part of that culture, right? So, for example, right, in some cultures it might be rude to not finish the food on your plate, right? And in another culture, it might be rude to finish the food on your plate, right? Maybe you're supposed to leave some, right? And so they're both the same act, but how we make sense of them are different, right? And what they actually mean in that culture are different. And when you can go into a culture and share in that meaning and understand that meaning, then that's when you become a part of that culture. So this is a very helpful definition of culture, particularly when a lot of you talked about in your introductory videos how you want to kind of get better at communicating with different cultures, right? You're like, I want to, I communicate cross-culturally, right? And a lot of that and our understanding of what is going on with different groups and how they communicate is using this anthropologic definition of culture, right? So for example, in some cultures, two men holding hands is more acceptable than in other cultures, right? When you speak, right, how close do you stand to people when you speak? When you make an appointment, are you going to be on time to the minute, or are you supposed to be casually late, or a couple minutes late, right? All of those kinds of parameters and how good we can be in understanding that culture stem from this definition. So it really is a very helpful definition of culture. And yeah, it's tied to symbols, right? And our use of symbols. And it's important to remember that use of symbols are absolutely culturally bound, right? So if you make this symbol with the circle and your three fingers up, right, and you play for the Golden State Warriors, what does it mean, right? It means you hit a three-pointer and you're stoked, right? If you do this symbol and you are in the country of Brazil, right, it does not mean that you hit a three-pointer, right? If you do this symbol in different parts of the world, right, or, maybe this might mean A-OK, right? Anyone ever done that symbol for OK? There's actually a story about these guys, and they go to sell computers. They work for Dell, and they go to sell computers in Brazil. And they're giving a big presentation, and the presentation is going great. And one of the guys holds up his hand, and he makes this gesture to the guy in the back. Hey, this presentation is going great. We got this. And this symbol in Brazil is highly, highly offensive. It's something like worse than flipping someone the bird, right? And the demeanor of the audience totally changed. The demeanor of the guys who were going to buy the computer totally changed. And they didn't seal the deal, right? Because he was using this symbol, which didn't mean A-OK in that context, right? And that's why this is a helpful definition of culture, really for understanding cross-cultural communication, right? So what is, how far are we supposed to stand when we communicate with, when we travel to Japan, right? What's the communication style when we travel to India, or, these kinds of things. So it does give you a helpful framework for understanding the patterns and how groups make meaning out of their symbols. at the same time, right, we have to understand that all of our symbols, yeah, are totally contingent and culturally based, right? Even in terms of what's attractive or good looking, right? In chapter 1, there's the example of the guy who's in like his late 20s, mid to late 20s, and he makes great money. He makes like 70 grand a month. And you describe that to many American students, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, this guy's rocking. This guy's cool." And then you say, "Oh yeah," and then he lives with his parents, right? And people are like, "What?" Right? But folks from maybe non-American backgrounds are like, "Yeah, that's cool. They live with his parents, right?" And I had a buddy, a Filipino buddy, and he didn't move out of his house until he met a girl when he was like in his, I think it was like 3 years ago, actually. So we're 40, right? So he didn't move out till he was 37, right? So it's just a totally different understanding of what's cool, what's normal, quote unquote, in a given culture. So here you go, like which one of these guys is considered more attractive, right? And that is symbols, right? And what we're taught is kind of attractive or status, right? What confers status for a man, and well, gender expectations of what's a man supposed to do or choose or be, right? Are all really kind of socially constructed. And another way to think of this definition of culture, the anthropologic definition of culture, is socially constructed, right? Things get their meaning, right? Symbols get their meaning from the group, right? And that group meaning is a social constructed meaning. It comes from the group, right? And so again, very helpful model. The second definition or dimension of communication is culture as contested side of meaning. And I'll go ahead and pick this up in the second video.